Monday night, the national championship game between Washington and Michigan. Welcome back to a new episode of the Big Ten Show, where we try to bring on as many Big Ten personalities and talents as we can. And there's arguably no bigger than our guest today, Big Ten Ted. Ted, thanks for joining us. Can you let the folks know where they can find you?
Well, yeah, it looks like you got the Twitter handle there in my graphic at Big Ten Ted over there on Twitter, and then just search that also on YouTube. So that's got stuff going up there all the time, every single day it seems, or at least 5 or 6 days a week.
Absolutely. And right now there's a lot of content to even talk about. I mean, those two conference semifinal games were, in my opinion, the best semifinals we've had since all of this started. What were your initial thoughts on, either game?
Well, yeah, in terms of a year, right, when you kind of put two semifinals together, we've had a really good semifinal or a championship kind of in a vacuum, right, when you factor in the 3 games during a given year. Yeah, you have one good one here, but the other one kind of might be a little bit lopsided. But when you factor in 2 going all the way down to the last play of the game, what more could you ask for from a college football fan? I'll kind of start first with the granddaddy, with the Rose Bowl. Boy, was this was a uniform game of all uniform games. If you love traditional football, right, what Michigan was wearing, I was just praying that don't wear white pants, don't wear white jerseys. That's all. And they wore the absolutely perfect uniform that they should wear within the traditional setting that is the Rose Bowl. And it doesn't get more traditional from a uniform standpoint than the Alabama Crimson Tide. But this one was going to be all about physicality, and that's what it was, right? These defenses were so good, especially Michigan, right? What they were doing, confusing Alabama up front. You had a true freshman at tackle, right? Caden Proctor. Iowa fans know all about him. Number 1 player in the state of Iowa, flipped his commitment from Iowa to Alabama last year. He was kind of a part of that offensive line where Michigan was coming from all different angles. They had 5 sacks in the first half from 5 different guys, right? You factor in the Harrows, the McGregors, the Stewarts, Mason Graham up front in the middle. They were coming from every angle, and they did a great job. Now, Alabama kind of went into the locker room. They got it together a little bit. They did a really good job at making some adjustments, and I said it in my preview. You need to contain Jalen Milroe. And he got loose a little bit, right? A little bit more in that second half, kind of some back-breaking first down runs towards the end of this one. Boy, it really looked like Alabama was starting to impose their will a little bit there in the second half. Michigan, right? They were pinned back there in that third quarter. Great job by Alabama. They definitely won the special teams battle in this game over Michigan. Of course, the Wolverines had a miscue on the fumble on the extra point, as well as some other miscues on special teams. But boy, that when their backs were against the wall and maybe yours truly was doubting them a little bit, they came up big. J.J. McCarthy made the plays when they absolutely needed to make the plays and go down the field. And once they tied it up, it just seemed like the momentum shifted big time. I actually thought the momentum maybe shifted earlier than that after the Jalen Milroe fumble. Even though Michigan had a missed field goal on that seemed to be when everything seemed to change. You go back and watch the game where Alabama, after that fumble, they weren't as successful kind of moving the football up and down the field. So, yeah, and then once they got in, they tied that game. Once they got into overtime, all the momentum was on the side of the Michigan Wolverines, and it seemed like it was destiny right at that point for them to make the play. And possibly, right, the last play of the game where the snap is a little bit low. Did the center maybe cost Alabama this game? Possibly, right? Multiple snaps that were low and kind of behind Jalen Milroe. You could go back to their game against Auburn. Nearly cost them the game against Auburn as well. And then I'll quickly wrap up the Sugar Bowl. This was, once again, what we expected it to be. Up and down and up and down. Boy, I've been watching Big Ten football for a long time. And, even though Michael Penix Jr. has been a Pac-12 quarterback I don't know if I've seen a bigger jump and an improvement from a quarterback from what Michael Penix Jr. was at Indiana. He was good. There's no question about that. That 2020 season was magical for the Hoosiers. But from that Michael Penix to this Michael Penix, like you wouldn't have looked at 2020 Michael Penix and said, yeah, that guy's a top 5 pick in the NFL draft. He said, well, he's a good quarterback. But the jump and the improvement just speaks to Ryan Grubb. It speaks to Kalen DeBoer and the system they've put together at the University of Washington. And those receivers are just insane. Roma Dunze, for my money, if I have a vote, he's the Bolitnikoff Award winner, right? All due respect to Marvin Harrison Jr., prospect-wise, talent-wise, NFL-wise, he's maybe the top guy in that category. But when you look at this year in college football, it doesn't get any better than Roma Dunze. And then now you throw in Jalen Polk, who was a 1,000-yard receiver this year. Oh, and then you got Jalen McMillan, who beginning of the year, people thought maybe he was the best receiver out of them all, and now he's coming off of an injury. How do you stop him? You can't. You can't, but you throw at the quarterback, you throw in the wide receivers. The biggest cog in the machine could be that offensive line. The Joe Moore award-winning offensive line, right? The past 2 years, it was Michigan, and they won that award because of their ability to just bully you, block downhill, drive you in outside of the stadium. But Washington won it for a different reason. Their ability to protect their diamond, that is Michael Penix Jr. Fourth least sacks allowed this season. Boy, that might be as big as any. Might be as big as any factor in Washington's success here this season.
And I think that's going to be the key, for this game coming up on Monday. Yeah, Texas's defensive line is arguably the best in the country, and they were almost completely neutralized by that offensive line. A couple times they almost got to Penix, and Penix just pulled out some magic out of nowhere. And I have a feeling he's going to have to do that a couple more times coming Monday. But speaking of Monday, do you have any thoughts on a high level? I'm not asking for a prediction or anything. That's for your show. But what are your thoughts on the game and the matchup?
Well, let's start kind of where you just left off, and that matchup between Washington and Michigan when the Huskies have the football. You look at what Michigan, we talked about it already, what Michigan does from a defensive standpoint and what Jesse Minter does with different looks, right, in terms of different pressures coming off the edge, coming off the interior. Didn't happen as much against Alabama, but he will come off the corner of the defensive back spot as well. Guys like Sainer Still and Moore and Will Johnson and some of these others. But that's the matchup for me, because if Michael Penix can sit back there and he can throw darts all night long. Look, I don't care how good your defensive backs are. And the Michigan is as good as it gets, right? And then that is going to be a little bit of a challenge because this thing goes both ways, right? The Michigan is the best defense that Washington has seen and vice versa. Washington is the best offense that Michigan has seen. But if Michigan can't get pressure, you're asking a lot from your Johnsons, from your Sainer Stills, from your Josh Wallaces, from all those guys to cover these receivers for 2 seconds, for 3 seconds. That's asking a lot. Okay, that's why pressure is needed. So, Michael Penix Jr. does a fantastic job of shifting the pocket. Okay, so even if they do get a little bit of pressure, like even saw Texas. Texas had a big old goose egg, 0 sacks, but they were able to move the pocket a little bit. But Michael Penix Jr. such great awareness to get off. So Michigan, you got to get pressure. You got to get more pressure. It is going to be complicated. Delayed blitzes, you're going to have to get creative. Jesse Minter is going to earn his salary in this football game and how he dials it up. And he doesn't have a month to prepare for this game. Okay, he's got exactly 7 days, Monday to Monday, from the Rose Bowl to the national championship game in Houston, Texas. So that's kind of one thing I'm looking forward to. That is strength on strength, if you ever saw it, right? That is the definition of the irresistible force meets the immovable object, right? When you talk about number one versus number one, top offense in the country, top defense in the country. But for as good as Michigan's defense is, their actual defense, the 11 guys opposing from Washington, their best defense might be a solid run game, keeping the ball out of the hands of Michael Penix Jr., because if you can turn out 6-minute drives, 7-minute drives, and just play bully ball, old school Big Ten football, and just ram it down Washington's throat, puts a lot more pressure when Michael Penix is out there on the field to get touchdowns every single time. And the key is going to be just that, scoring touchdowns, right? Because field goals, you saw Washington maybe get, I don't know if you called it a little bit complacent, but they had a chance, a killer instinct to really put that game away against Texas, but field goal after field goal after field goal, and they stayed in it. Michigan is the second-ranked red zone defense in all of college football this season, okay? Teams have scored 16 out of 23 times that they've been in the red zone. Just 3 of those 16 have been passing touchdowns. So maybe a little bit of a dose of Dylan Johnson in the red zone for the Huskies. I can't wait for this matchup. This is as good as it gets. Maybe I'm coming a little bit from your guys' angle, from the Big Ten angle a little bit. It's been a minute, right? Since the Big Ten is since 2020, and before that since 2014, and it's only been Ohio State. Now you got two teams from the 2024 Big Ten that are going to be in it. Maybe I'm coming a little bit from that angle, but overall, as a college football fan, you got to love this matchup.
If you don't mind, I'm going to bounce a question off you here, Ted. Just looking at it philosophically, right? Both teams, of course, going to the national championship have momentum, but it seems like they're capturing lightning in a bottle a little bit two different ways, right? Michigan more so riding the news of, everything going on with the cheating scandal. It seems like they're just playing as a unit. They're playing as one, right? It seems like they're keeping everything, their visions within themselves, and they're kind of rallying around each other and using this as a rallying cry. Washington more so seems like they're being slept on, right? Underdogs in both Oregon games, right? They're opened as 4.5-point underdogs in this game. So they have something to prove as well as Michigan has having something to prove, which is it adds another dynamic to this game because of the way it's going about, and partially I was wondering if this too almost feels like last year where TCU's kind of like, written off, and then Michigan's been at the top, the majority of the season, been right there top two. How much does that factor into, where it's breaking down the talent on the field, but how much does that factor in? And what do you think, which mentality do you think is going to reign supreme here? And how much of the impact is that going to have?
Boy, who's the underdog? You got Michigan versus everybody, and then you've got people like me picking against Washington twice. So that's a great question, because who's going to really dive? I think both teams are really going to dive into that, right? Michigan has really banded together. Whatever side you take or whatever take you have on this sign stealing thing, I think one thing is for certain. Okay, whether it's been Harbaugh specifically or Sharon Moore, this whole coaching staff, they clearly said, we're going to use this as an opportunity to band together, and the whole T-shirts of Michigan versus everybody and everything as well. But I think you maybe got to look at Washington in this game, because Michigan is going to go down as the favorite once again, and kind of the early returns of some of the national pundits are leaning towards the University of Michigan. Okay, but you got to look at Washington. It's, once we've gotten to this point, now that they've beaten Oregon twice and they've beaten Texas, you can't take these. You can't take the Huskies lightly. Like, you just can't. Like, you look at how talented they are. They've got NFL players all over that football field. So I think Washington is really going to carry in a lot of motivation into this game once again. And 4.5, I'd maybe tighten that up a little bit. I think it's going to be that close. I think it's going to be that competitive in this game. But when you talk about the motivational factor, like you brought up, maybe Washington is bringing in a little bit more juice, just because, once again, they're being doubted. Okay, and they've really ridden off of that ever since they beat Oregon back on October 14th, and then they get back to the Pac-12 title game, and they were underdogs once again on a neutral field. Man, I think they've really taken that personally, so to speak. But yeah, I think they're going to take a decent amount of motivation into this game, maybe a little bit more juice than Michigan.
I completely agree with you. I've, like you, took basically whoever Washington was playing in the previous 3 games, and I've changed my mind. I'm at this point now where I'm actually taking Washington to not only cover the spread on Monday. I think they're going to win. In my opinion, the game is going to go over. What I'm unsure about is whether Michigan can hit 30. I think Washington right now is on such a roll. Penix seems healthy. They've got 3 wide receivers who could all go in the first round. So for me, it's going to be more interesting to see whether JJ and Michigan, they're not going up against Jalen Monroe in this game, where you can just shut down and make a quarterback win with his legs. Now, Penix is going to get his yards. The receivers are going to get their yards. So, I agree with you. I'm just completely – I apologize to all of Husky Nation. I was wrong. You guys are right. I think the spread in the conference championship game was, I think, 9.5.
It was almost 10, yeah.
Yeah, and I took the Ducks, thinking, at the end of the first game, Oregon seemed to have all the momentum. And I learned my lesson. I learned a lot. I lost a lot of money on that game, and not anymore. I'm going to go with Washington. Ted, I do have a question. Obviously, we just talked about Washington and their dynamic offense, which is kind of atypical of what these Pac-12 teams kind of played like throughout their history. And then we have the prototypical Big Ten team: tough nose, defense, physical, runs the ball,
Time of possession.
Yep. Now, it's one thing when you meet in a national championship with two different conferences, two different styles. A lot of these styles are going to be blending into the Big Ten starting next year. What kind of adjustments do you think some of these teams are going to have to make? Because Michigan can out Michigan a lot of teams. Maybe Michigan's a bad example because they're clearly superior to the other teams in the conference. But a team like Washington and Oregon, they're going to have to adjust to a more physical style of play, and a Michigan, a Penn State, they're going to have to adjust a little bit to not necessarily going all in on a run, but handling a dynamic offense. How do you think these teams are going to kind of, strategize moving forward?
Well, I can't. This is another reason why I love this matchup. Styles make fights is a fantastic phrase that exists out there. And I said it in my preview that dropped on Thursday. Styles make fights is going to be one hell of a fight. And this is kind of a precursor of what we're going to see in the Big Ten starting in 2024. So if you're maybe a traditional Big Ten fan, this is kind of gets you a little bit excited about the offense that's going to come into this league. If you're a West Coast fan, you're kind of looking at this from this is what Big Ten defenses are like. That's what makes this so exciting. That's what makes the future so exciting is the contrast of styles. Right. We've been talking about it on my channel a lot from a TV perspective, of course, with CBS and NBC kind of coming into the fold. And this is, I think, what makes it very attractive is you have an Oregon team, right? Their big national brand. Of course, that's going to carry a large TV audience, and then taking on a team like an Iowa, right? That is a contrast of styles if you ever saw one. And I think that makes these very intriguing matchups because for the longest times in these two leagues, you kind of knew what you were getting to the Big Ten. Yeah, I know Ohio State was an explosive team, but you look at a lot of these teams, Wisconsin historically, Iowa historically, Michigan historically, Michigan State under Mark D'Antonio was a very physical, defensive-minded team as well. You kind of knew what you were getting, right, in the Big Ten Conference. You were getting bully ball across most of the league. West Coast, right, this is a conference that has been known to develop some of the best quarterbacks that we've seen. Look at Oregon under Chip Kelly. Look at all of the USC, the Carson Palmers, the Matt Leinerts, even guys to like a Matt Barkley and others, Caleb Williams, and all these guys that have come through the University of Southern California. And then you look at Washington. Like, people forget Washington made the playoff in 2016 as well under Chris Peterson. And Jake Browning and that team was a pretty good football team as well. Don James back in the 90s did some really good things as well. The Pac-12 historically has been known. Like, you look at your Aaron Rodgers at Cal, you could go down the list of some of the quarterbacks that have come out of the Pac-12, and the contrast of styles is what makes this so fun. So how do teams kind of bridge and how do they adjust, right? These West, and I always said, you got to meet in the middle. This thing isn't so black and white where everybody's going to have to throw for 400 a game or defenses are going to have to hold people to 200 a game, right? That's not how this is going to be. They're going to meet in the middle, right? It's going to be a gray area, right? Some of these teams on the West Coast, they're going to have to get beefier. They're going to have to get better on defense. I'm looking at USC. Good hires on the defensive side of the ball for the Trojans. They look to be at least improved, right, on the offensive side of the ball, or defensive side of the ball, I should say, going to 2024. So West Coast teams need a little bit tougher, need a little bit beefier on the inside. These other teams in the Midwestern footprint, the traditional footprint, they need to get more explosive on the perimeter. Looking at you, Iowa. I know we've got Lincoln Riley and Kirk Ferentz have kind of been subtweeting each other, so to speak, kind of going back and forth in some of their interviews. And that is, I wish they would have played in a bowl game. I know maybe the records and the pairings didn't really match up, but seeing that USC offense against Iowa's offense and defense, I think would have been the ultimate contrast of styles in a bowl game. I kind of wish they would have been able to do that. But that's what's going to make this beautiful is Iowa. Like, let's use them as an example. Okay, they have been built. Kirk Ferentz, and believe me, I probably wouldn't have done it a different way. So I'm going to give KF the benefit of the doubt here. He built his team to win the Big Ten West. He built his team to compete in that division. Okay, you play 6 out of your 9 league games against the Wisconsins, against the Minnesotas, against the Illinois, against teams like that. And that's how you have to win, by playing really good defense, great sound special teams, things like that. And that's what Iowa has done. Now, Iowa's going to draw Oregon. Iowa's going to draw Washington. Iowa's going to draw USC. They're not going to draw Illinois every year. They're not going to draw Northwestern every year. So they kind of got to meet in the middle, and it's going to be very entertaining to see. Iowa is one of those examples that you're going to see. Where is this team going to go? Because they've been living at the top of the Big Ten West. They've been feeding at the top of that division. Now that division doesn't exist anymore. What are their expectations going to be? People are going to have to adjust expectations, whether you're a West Coast incoming team or whether you're a traditional team. Kind of adjust, because Ohio State, Penn State, Michigan, Oregon, Washington, USC, that's 6. That's your top 6 there. I didn't even mention Wisconsin. I didn't mention Iowa. I didn't mention Nebraska, right? There's Michigan State, right? This conference has the potential to be extremely deep.
And bouncing off of that point, you mentioned Chip Kelly's offense over in Oregon, Scott Frost being the OC there. And just by the sample size that we know, right? Scott Frost, coming over when he came over from UCF to the Big Ten, talking about he wants the Big Ten to adjust to his style of play. Secondly, when you're talking about getting bigger and beefier, in the world of the transfer portal, offensive lines and building beefier, in the trenches is something, in my opinion, that needs to be built, especially offensive line in the recruiting process. It's hard to get a bunch of transfer portal linemen to come together as a unit and cohesive. That's something that a lot of the Big Ten has already established. So, with it being somewhat easier to get skill player positions and instant guys on the outside and quarterback and running back via the portal, do you think it's going to be a little bit more of the Pac-12 taking a little bit more time to adjust to the Big Ten versus the vice versa? Because you've got teams with athletes all over the field like Michigan and Ohio State that can, stay out there and run with these guys from the Pac-12. So do you think it's going to be a little bit more difficult for them, and maybe they're going to have to slide over to the Big Ten style a little bit more?
I see what you're saying. Yeah, with that. And it is very important to recruit the interior. I could see more if you want. I could see maybe the Pac shifting more to the physicality, maybe dipping their toe into the Midwestern footprint and recruiting to try to grab some of these Midwestern farm boys up front in the offensive line. I could see that more, because you look at a team like we just mentioned, Iowa's, Nebraska's, Wisconsin's, even though they're kind of changing their philosophy a little bit. But yeah, you can grab really good skill players, right? Because they kind of realize what they're worth on the NIL market in this transfer portal thing. So you can get a quarterback, like you can get running back, you can get wide receivers, as you mentioned. So yeah, I could very well see that happening. Will it take so when you look at the West Coast schools, will it take them a little bit to adjust? Yeah, but I think it's going to take some time to adjust to these offenses as well. Like that's why this national championship game, kind of circling back to that, is a good barometer of where things are really going to stand, because there's people out there saying that Big Ten defenses are as good as they are because they don't take on a lot of offenses. But then you look at what Ohio State did, shutting out a good Missouri offense, for 3 quarters. Okay. Their offense was their offense in that game. But, and then you look at what Michigan was able to do against an Alabama offense. So, I don't really subscribe to that theory that it's, well, you're taking on bad Big Ten offenses. So I think because of that, these Pac offenses that are coming in, these Pac teams that are going to come in, are going to have to adjust to maybe the style of defense, the scheme of defense is just going to be a lot different. And that's what's going to make everything so fun. That's what's going to make everything so unpredictable. Unpredictable, I think, is the word that I want to use for 2024 as a whole, right? From the Big Ten perspective, yes. But then you look at around the country, who knows what's going to happen in the Big 12? We've never had these cluster of teams together, right? But when we specifically look at this conference, it's the unpredictability, I think, that makes things. Will West Coast teams need to beef up? Will they need to recruit in the Midwest? Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Will traditional Big Ten teams need to adjust? Absolutely. But I think the one thing that I know is I don't know which way it's going to go. I don't know if the West Coast teams are going to put up 30, 35. It could happen. I don't know if they're going to get punched in the mouth a little bit. That's why 2024 is so intriguing. If you're a television executive at CBS and NBC, you're saying, bring it on, because all these fans are going to tune into these games thinking, can Iowa slow down Oregon? Okay. Yep. Is Oregon just going to light up Iowa? How's that going to work?
Yep. And last point, and then Sonny, I'll let you ask the next question. Similar to what you said, we're going to get that in this game, and that's what makes it even more exciting. Is that we're seeing it at the top, right? We're seeing it from the two top teams in these two, conferences that are going to be coming together. And what a better, example of what we can expect than two teams that are already at their high level, at their highest level, and coming over to next season, there's going to be disparity, but at least we can see the styles play out, and it's kind of a preview of what we get, and we get it at the top level, at the highest level of each conference. So.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to this matchup. But I think one thing, but before we get back to Sonny, that we got to really take into consideration, okay, is Michigan is a loaded team. They're going to go through a lot of turnover. Even if JJ McCarthy comes back, I said this coming into the season before Cheeseburger Gate and the sign stealing thing. This is a last dance opportunity for Jim Harbaugh. Look at all of these guys that are coming back, flirted with the Vikings, flirted with the Broncos. It's clear he wants to right the wrong of winning the Super Bowl, right? He did in that Brother Bowl all those years ago. So I think that's very clear. Like, Michigan's going to go through some turnover. Okay, so how are they going to reload their roster? Washington is going to go through some turnover as well. So for the Big Ten to keep going at this level, okay, they're going to need these guys. And Washington's done a good job, right? Will Rogers is coming in as a transfer quarterback. They got a receiver out of Cal. I think Jeremiah Hunter, who's the number 8 wide receiver in the portal. So, and they've got depth at that position. So it's going to be all about reloading and keeping these teams at these levels to be able to get some of these possible Big Ten versus Big Ten championships in the future.
Speaking of the Big Ten versus Big Ten championship that we're about to have on Monday. Now, in my opinion, Michigan, was clearly the superior team against Alabama last weekend. And that kind of phrase isn't really said very often. Washington was up on Texas, and they kind of let Texas get closer to the game at the end, whether by kneeling or not kneeling. And, the score may have been closer than it should have been. Now, obviously we know, and I'm a Big Ten guy, but I'll always hand up a Big Ten homer. I have no problem admitting to the SEC supremacy over the last 15 plus years when it comes to play on the football field. But I do feel like that's sort of shifting now. And, in my opinion, you and I have kind of discussed this before, with the Big Ten, with the quality of quarterbacks that are going to be in this conference moving forward. And now the quality of head coaches, which we already had a bunch of good head coaches in the conference. And now we're adding a Lincoln Riley, Kalen DeBoer. We're adding some high quality coaches. I'm very excited about how the Big Ten is going to be both perceived and just simply match up on the field against the SEC, and essentially what's going to be a power 2 moving forward. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, this was big. Like, I've said it on my channel before, and it's just like, man, when you've gone in these bowl games year after year, yes, the Big Ten will win some, but let's call it as it is. In SEC bias, right? That's a term that comes up a lot. And if you want to start to chip away at this SEC bias, you got to win on the field. The reason why the SEC and that narrative exists and why that all is present is because they win. They win national championships. They win big games. However you say, hey, there's better players in the South, or whatever reason you give, the fact of the matter is they win those games. That's why this season, okay, a current Big Ten champion beating a current SEC champion in the Rose Bowl, a future Big Ten team beating a future SEC team in these 2 semifinals. That's why this is so big. But the SEC has been doing this for 20 years. Okay, they've been at the top of this sport really ever since the Pete Carroll and USC era kind of fell off after that 2005 season. So in that 2006 Florida team with Chris Leak and Urban Meyer kind of came into thing. Ever since then, it's been SEC, right, as far as the eye can see. Pretty much. So if the Big Ten wants to start to chip into that, you need to win some games. That's why Wisconsin and LSU was so heartbreaking. That was a chance for the Big Ten. The Big Ten went 3-4, right, in the postseason against, if you count Washington and Texas. They went 3-4, the Big Ten did, against the SEC. They win that game. The script kind of flips a little bit. So you need to, like, this is 1 year. Okay, don't get me wrong. This is a very big deal. This is a big year, but you need to stack these years. right? If you really look, you're not going to beat the SEC every year. Like, let's call it as it is. That's not going to happen. Okay, it's best for the sport if this thing's going to kind of go back and forth a little bit. But you can't have, I forgot what it was at one time. There were multiple, more than a decade, maybe consecutive years, maybe before Clemson kind of came around, where the SEC is taking home the national championship trophy. You need to mix that up a little bit. You need, so like you said, you need some Michigans, you need some USCs, some Oregons, some Washingtons, Ohio States, Penn States, etc. You need those teams at the top to be able to compete. So not everybody nationally can say, well, look at the SEC, they're better because they win all the time. Now you kind of chip into that argument if you win these games. You get, like this year, a Big Ten versus Big Ten 2024 alignment anyway, national championship game. So it comes down to on the field. Like that's it. So if the Big Ten can really start to win some of these football games, they're going to start to chip away at that. And the narrative is going to start to change a little bit. Now, next season, you've got a 12-team college football playoff. Let's call it as it is. I'm pretty sure you guys share the same sentiment, because Sonny, you just mentioned the term power two. You're going to have the conference champion for the Big 12. You're going to have the conference champ from the ACC as long as that conference exists. And then you're going to have a bunch, and then you're going to have your G5 team, your G5 representative. And let's call it as it is. You're going to have a lot of Big Ten and SEC teams. All right, you might throw in another ACC team as long as they have like the Clemsons of the world, Clemson, FSU. Who knows? Maybe Miami will eventually jump up there, but that's not looking like a bright possibility right now. But I mean, look at the Big 12. Okay, who are some of the Big 12's best brands right now? Okay, could you throw in Colorado? Well, a team that went 4-8 last season. Now they are. Look, Dion has them going the right trajectory. Right, going from 1 win to 4 wins is no slouch. Going from 1 win to 8 wins is also pretty good. Looking at you, David Braun. But I really believe that when you look at the Big 12, they don't have the brands historically. They don't have the teams that compete at the top, because you need to essentially get into the top 10 to be an at-large team, right? Because you look at the G5 representative likely coming from outside of the top 12. So it's going to be a lot of Big Ten. It's going to be a lot of SEC, and you're going to need to win some of those head-to-head playoff games that you're going to see. Because as we kind of venture further down, there's been a lot of discussion about meaningless bowl games. As we venture down, these playoff games are going to be, the impact of those games, winning or losing them, is going to rise that much more in a 12-team format.
Quick question too. So based on, kind of what you're talking about, how the pressure's on, the Big Ten to start winning these games, to caveat with that, not only on the field, but, the Big Ten, for what it's worth, it seems like almost even with this game, everything's going to kind of reset next year in the arms race of the business. We're going way more into a business, of course, with the players being paid, and now these big, huge TV deals, and the conferences are essentially turning into less of geographics and more of business. And that's essentially what they are now.
Yep.
So with the Big Ten being in the situation they are, and it seems like, Michigan with the cheating stuff, and then, Ohio State, do you think this almost in these individualities of these brands, do you think that's something that could potentially hurt the Big Ten in the arms race moving forward, and even more give it a reason why they need to produce on the field just in the future, of these negotiations and stuff like that? If the SEC, continues to kind of work as a unit like they do, is that going to hurt the Big Ten in the long run off the field, and then that potentially hurt the nationwide opinion of the Big Ten?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I think I don't know if it'll hurt the Big Ten necessarily, but I think it all comes down, right, as we just said, it comes down to that on the field perspective. And it would not surprise me to see, and this is maybe something we could save for another day, kind of put it in the rainy day jar, so to speak. The SEC and the Big Ten, in my lifetime, I don't know if I've ever seen the SEC and Big Ten commissioners work together as much as they are right now. Right. That's one thing that I've really seen. And there have been rumblings. Okay. And some people say it could happen. Some people say that ain't happening. Is a possible breakaway, right, of some sort. We don't know what it could look like between the SEC and the Big Ten. But I've seen stuff where Tony Petitti and Greg Sankey are sitting shoulder to shoulder, and only Tony Petitti and Greg Sankey are on Capitol Hill talking to some federal lawmakers about legislation as it pertains to NIL and certain things like that. Okay, like, I'm just going to lay out a scenario. Okay. And I'm not saying this is great for the sport. Okay. But man, would it drive interest. And if we're talking about dollars and cents, okay. If we're going NFL style, right? You mentioned going more towards a business, right? With this side of with college sports right now, you want to go all NFL, dive in. We look at AFC and NFC, Big Ten and SEC, and we know how popular the NFL playoffs are, right? Instead of having a conference championship the first week of December, the bigger these conferences get, the more it's going to be difficult to just have one conference championship game to decide some of these tiebreakers. I mean, how cool would it be if you had the Big Ten over here, the SEC champion over here, and you had 8 teams in a playoff? You play quarterfinals, semifinals, a championship, and then an SEC versus Big Ten in a Super Bowl, like where the national championship is. I think this would require them to pick from the ACC, right? Notre Dame, Florida State, et cetera, go to the Big Ten, North Carolina, NC State, Virginia, whatever, go to the SEC. But if you have that kind of Super Bowl, this side versus that side type of thing in the national championship, that could be very, very beneficial. And I believe we are closer to that happening than we've ever been. Remember Kevin Warren, right? Remember the alliance, right? They were creating a voting block against the SEC. Now you've got the SEC and the Big Ten commissioner side by side, shoulder to shoulder, close as they've ever been, going to Capitol Hill to try to figure this thing out together. Yep. So that's the way I see it from. And here's the thing. I just want to say this before we kind of move on to the next thing. Mm-hmm. We are living in such a charade right now. Like we were living in a charade for a while that these kids are student athletes. All right. Let's just now with NIL, let's call it as it is. These kids are employees pretty much. Right. Yeah. And I think that's the next step in the line is collectively bargaining and all of this stuff. We are in and when we got kids, college kids driving Lamborghinis, right to practice. And that's fine. Right. A lot of people, administrators and universities have been making money on the backs of these kids for forever. But we're just still trying to hang on to that thread that is amateurism. I'm like, I'm in the boat where I'm just like, you know what? If we're going to plunge into this NFL style, just go all in. Just go all in on it. And let's not really pretend anymore. If kids want to take a class or two, fine. If they want to earn a degree, great. Good for them. But that's kind of the way I feel. Like I did some math and I'm like, if you take $4 million per year per school from the TV deal, that's going to be making about $80 to $100 million per school. Each kid, 85 scholarship athletes, can make on average $47,000 a year. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's all I'm saying. I think that's the direction that this sport is eventually going. There are going to be people that are going to resist it, right? The NCAA has come up with a proposal of their own, but this college football has always operated in silos. And I think conferences are the ones that are going to have to really take the ball on this one.
Yeah, because Matt Rule alluded to just quickly about how, nothing's really set in stone there's no contracts for these guys, right? You got your NIL and stuff like that. And they may have their, contracts with certain marketing companies, but as far as the university is not allowed to necessarily negotiate and have these guys sign on paper. And, I just think that's inevitable, just kind of ironing out those details. That's why some of these promises are made and not kept. And I think that's going to be, the players are going to bring that up. And it's inevitable that it's going to go that direction for sure.
Well, and it needs to go. Like, I think, out of all, you've seen multiple national commentators saying, these are the problems. This is what needs to be fixed. Yep. Top of that list has to be player compensation, player collective bargaining, unionization, things like that. Because once we get to that level and once we can collectively bargain, okay, if you know anything, I'm a part of a union, okay, here in Minnesota. And if we know anything about a union, it's a lot of give and take. Yep. Okay, right now we're pro player, and that's great. They're getting, but we are way on the side of pro player right now. Now you bring in and you collectively bargain. Okay, a lot of people talk about guardrails. Okay, athletes, you can give or you can take this, but you got to give this back. Mm-hmm. Okay, you can take. We'll pay you a salary or transfer. Like when you sign out of high school, you'll sign a 2-year deal, like professional. You'll sign a 1-year deal, maybe with a 1-year option. Okay, yep. Maybe a 2-year deal, right? And then when your 2-year deals comes up, then you can transfer, like free agency, right? So I think that's the way. That's got to be at the top of the list. And I know some people, and administrators are going to be just clutching on to student athletes because they don't want to pay this money. I get it. I understand it. They want to build bigger and better facilities. They want to upgrade the science building. They want to pay their professors more. I get it. But I think this is something that needs to happen. These revenue sports, the football, men's and women's basketball, and to satisfy Title IX, to have women's sports, maybe it's something like volleyball in there as well to really start this, because I think we just need to stop the charade that these people are student athletes, right? Cardale Jones, we come here to play school. Like this goes further back than 2020, folks.
Big Ten Ted, thank you so much for your time today. You dropped a lot of knowledge, and again, I'm telling all our followers, subscribers, if you're interested in the least bit in Big Ten content, Big Ten Ted's the guy to go to. You can find him on YouTube. I think you started a podcast. You're on the podcast networks too, right? Am I?
Yeah, I gotta get going a little bit more. Been busy with all the football, but once we get into the off season, I'll be regularly uploading stuff to some audio podcast platforms, so you can watch out for that coming down as well. But as you said, Twitter at Big Ten Ted on Twitter, and then YouTube doing uploaded and live shows as well.
Thank you again, Ted. You can follow us at the Big Ten Show, both on Twitter, and you can find us on YouTube. And we're going to continue our coverage of the national championship game between Washington and Michigan on Monday. We've got a couple more shows lined up, and we'll